Okay, welcome everyone to the Department of English Literature. We're delighted to be here this evening for the third annual Birmingham Wine Read Lecture, which is a collaboration between the Arts of Place Network and the Oxford Centre for Life Writing. And it's lovely to have colleagues from Oxford with us, as well as lots of familiar Arts of Place faces. Those who might be new to Arts of Place are also very welcome, especially colleagues who've come downstairs from the History Department, and also those from the University of Birmingham Centre for Reformation and Early Modern Studies. Arts of Place started in the autumn of 2020 as a forum for cultural and imaginative work on the historical, inherited and emerging meanings of place. Our events and conversations involve specialists and students from a range of disciplines and professions. We try to ask questions about how we read or interpret, remember and imagine places. In doing so, we try to answer questions about identity, belonging, sustainability, and the importance of place in shaping people and cultures. The Wine Read Lecture is a moment when we try to do this through the lens of life writing, and we couldn't wish for a more appropriate and eminent person to address us tonight than Alexandra Walsham. Alexandra Walsham is Professor of Modern History at the University of Cambridge, and one of the world's leading experts on the impacts and consequences of the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. She's published widely and influentially, authoring major studies of providence, of religious tolerance and intolerance in early modern England, of post-Reformation Catholicism in England, of miracles, the supernatural and landscape in post-Reformation society and culture. In addition, she's edited collections of essays on the history of the book, on reading and record keeping during the Reformations, and on nostalgia and memory. She was principal investigator on an AHRC-funded interdisciplinary project, Remembering the Reformation, and her recent work, which we've got a copy of here, is a groundbreaking study of how age, ancestry, and generational change shaped the course of the Reformation. She was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 2009 and has been a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Arts since 2013. In 2017, she was appointed a CBE for services to history. One of the most impressive things I find about Alexandra's research is the way she presents huge shifts in British religious and cultural history through an accumulation of impeccably researched evidence of the lives of individuals and communities. From tiny details of family histories, such as those of 3 generations of the Collins family of Lollards in the Oxfordshire village of Burford, to fascinating etymologies, whether that's tracing the origin of the name of Halifax to beliefs about a yew tree that miraculously gained holy hair, or explaining links between early modern uses of the word gossip and the role of godparents. More than that, Alexandra's work is foundational and to the extent to which it generously offers new approaches and methodologies to other scholars. Whether they be doctoral students thinking about Wordsworth's interest in monastic history, as I was when I first read The Reformation of the Landscape, or leading historians applying questions of generations to other periods and issues. England's long Reformation was, she writes in Generations, in multiple respects, a family affair, and indeed a family quarrel. She manages to reach the heart of the turmoil and human experience beneath Reformation history by reminding us of how our own family dynamics and disagreements might map onto those played out in national life. And those dynamics are as relevant the week before the coronation of King Charles III as they were when Charles I and II were on the throne. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra.
Well, thank you so much, Jessica. That was an excessively generous introduction, but I'm most grateful to have been invited to deliver this lecture, and it's lovely to be reunited with a family of historians and literary scholars that I already know. Okay, so this almanac is one of the most poignant documents I've encountered in the course of my work on the generations. Calculated for Oxford in 1673, as the note inside the back cover reveals, this small leather-bound pocketbook once belonged to a young university student from Nantwich in Cheshire by the name of Tom Wilbraham. Sadly, and to the great grief of his father, he died 2 years later on the 8th of September, aged just 18. On the first anniversary of this event, his mother expired suddenly, evidently unable to recover from the loss of her beloved eldest son, which had followed swiftly in the wake of the death of his younger brother, Richard, who was then only 6. The almanac was subsequently reused by Roger Wilbraham to record a series of memoranda and remembrances. It includes a calendar of such matters whereon my thoughts and pen have been employed at vacant hours, since I lost my best companion, his dear wife and chiefest earthly comfort, to whom he'd been married 20 years. Bespeaking the anguish and loneliness of a mourning father and widower, this printed book serves both as a tangible memorial of this double tragedy and as a space and place for life writing. It's one of several similar almanacs that survive in the Cheshire Record Office, alongside a remarkable family diary that extends from 1513 to 1962. Transmitted from father to son, the chronicle relates how the Wilbrahams navigated the religious upheavals of the Henrician, Edwardian and Elizabethan eras, as well as the civil wars that broke out a century later, culminating in the execution of Charles I on the 30th of January 1649. This shocked Roger so much that he fell into a hectic fever, which impaired his health for many years thereafter. Although some of the later male Wilbrahams, into whose hands this diary passed, were less assiduous in recording the family's history, they nevertheless continued it into the mid-20th century, recounting the local impact of German bombing raids in 1940 and the downward turn of its fortunes against the backdrop of post-war privation and rising taxation. This necessitated moving out of the family's traditional home, Delamere Manor, an impressive mansion built in 1784, as well as the sale of its most precious paintings, including Titian's Mistress, though a few items of sentimental value were retained. The Xerox copy in the Chester Record Office was deposited by Captain Ralph Wilbraham of Brookhouse, Cuddington. I do not know whether the original still survives and if it has been extended further by subsequent generations. It nevertheless stands as a compelling emblem of the themes that I want to explore in this lecture. My aim is to illustrate that the generation is a neglected site of life writing and record keeping in early modern England. I seek to explore the underappreciated role of families in the preservation of the past and in the creation of legacies for posterity. By focusing on individuals and communities who derived their identities from a shared location in time, I also hope to offer a fresh perspective on the intersection between the arts of memory and the arts of place. The context and backdrop for my inquiry is the prolonged period of religious turbulence associated with the English Reformation, a fraught, fractious and incomplete process that extended from the 1520s and 30s to the 1640s, 50s and beyond. As I argue in my book, this had paradoxical effects. It both strengthened the bonds within and between families of blood and families of faith, and simultaneously tested and frayed inter- and intra-generational ties in various ways. It transformed the lives of the generations that experienced it and reshaped the horizontal relationships that early modern people formed with their siblings, kin, and peers, as well as the vertical ones that linked them with their departed ancestors and their future heirs. First, it's necessary to lay some conceptual and historiographical foundations. What is a generation? This is an unusually rich and resonant term with multiple meanings. It describes the action and fact of bringing something into existence, in particular a living organism, whether an animal, plant, or human being. It pinpoints a moment of creation, origin, and birth, and it's a synonym for reproduction, procreation, and the propagation of species. At the same time, the word also refers to both the process of generating and the product of that process, the thing that is generated. In the medieval and early modern eras, it predominantly meant ancestry, lineage, and descent, or an account of this in the form of a genealogy or pedigree, as well as family or breed. These definitions have drifted out of use and are now largely obsolete, but they were alive and well in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Other senses of the term have proved more resilient, notably its use as a collective noun to describe a group of people born and living at about the same time, that is to say, a group of coevals. It's also shorthand for the average time that it takes for children to grow up, become adults, and have children of their own, which is generally understood to be around 30 years. In turn, generation is deployed as a rough measure of historical time and its passing. It remains one of the principal ways in which we periodize the past. The sheer ubiquity of the word generation in what Naomi Tadmor has called the social universe of the English Bible must be emphasized. It saturated Scripture, especially the Old Testament, which begins with Genesis and the generations of Adam and Eve. The Gospel of Matthew is a genealogy of Christ's succession from King David. Luke traces his natural ancestry to Abraham. It's similarly pervasive in the Reformed liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer. The entry on generation in the Canterbury minister Thomas Wilson's Christian Dictionary, first published in 1612, is indicative of both its prevalence and its polyvalency in early modern religious culture. It denoted origin and pedigree, community, history, chronology, and eternity. Wilson's fourth definition is particularly pertinent for our purposes in its emphasis on the metaphorical inflection of the original Hebrew word, which implied durance and durable dwelling and abiding. In short, it signified a place of abode in the fabric of time. A fundamental term for describing the process of begetting offspring, generation was singularly relevant to the story of Christianity. The Christian God is both a father and son, begotten by a sublime union between the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary. The Bible and the Apocrypha gave rise to an iconography that celebrated the Holy Family and Christ's kindred, and that depicted the descendants of Jesse as a many-branched tree that sprang out of the patriarch's side. It's still widely assumed that generations as a form of imagined community are a byproduct of modernity. More particularly, their emergence has often been connected with the idea that time was accelerating, prompted by the experience of revolutionary events. This reflects the influence of the pioneering social scientists, theorists of generation, starting with Auguste Comte in the 1840s, but reaching a peak in the 1920s and 30s with the work of François Maitre, José Ortega y Gasset, and especially Karl Mannheim, for whom it served as a useful counterpoint to the Marxist preoccupation with class. It's in the context of the crises of the world wars and nationalist struggles for liberation and independence that the merits of this fertile and troublesome concept have most frequently been recognised. For scholars such as Robert Vall, Mary Fulbrook and Roy Foster, it's a route to comprehending the formation of a sense of solidarity and collective consciousness in response to traumatic 20th century developments. It's a premise of Wall's study that generations are not born, they are made. Fulbrook and Foster likewise investigate them as in large part epiphenomena of identity and memory. In the cohort model that has dominated most recent studies, generations are understood as a form of dwelling in time and space and a vehicle for thought and action. Historians and sociologists alike have frequently cut them loose from their genealogical anchor, separating out the strands of definition that relate to family, kinship, ancestry and lineage. By contrast, I argue that we must consider the biological, social and historical dimensions of generations in conjunction with each other. The coexisting meanings of the term cannot be disentangled in contemporary thinking, nor should they be in academic inquiry. Here, I want to bring these observations into conversation with recent developments in the history of life writing. The appearance of autobiography in the 16th century was once part of a teleological story about the rise of individualism. In their search for the eloquent I, scholars have long identified the Renaissance as a crucible in which the impulse for self-fashioning emerged, and seen the advent of Protestantism as a powerful stimulus to subjectivity and habits of interiority. The revival of biography in the same era has similarly been linked with a humanist quest for fame, an emerging cult of personality, and the role of the Reformation in displacing attention from intercession for the dead towards a celebratory presentation of their moral virtues, intended to provoke the living to emulate them. Our understanding of these genres, however, has been transformed over the last decade and a half and more. Adam Smith's autobiography in early modern England has drawn attention to varieties of life writing whose very inclusivity and taxonomical strangeness, generic unfixity and experimentation test our inherited assumptions. He discovers individuals writing about their lives in a variety of works that do not neatly fit into dominant templates, from bureaucratic records such as parish registers and financial accounts to commonplace books and almanacs. Others have trained their ears to listen for inwardness in unlikely places, including polemic and fiction. Meanwhile, as Tom Webster has taught us, the voices of interiority that emanate from spiritual journals are ironically the product of a religious culture that revolved around the duty of denying the self. Forms of writing to redundancy, as he puts it, they are frequently characterized by a rhetoric of self-denigration. Victoria Van Heining has demonstrated that monastic self-writing was similarly regarded as both superfluous and vital. The anonymity of such texts evinces the need of the religious to speak without being named, and reflected their status as metaphorically dead to the world. It's also important to locate introspection in the midst of an overpowering concern with Christian community. Andrew Cambers has demonstrated that diaries were written for the benefit of posterity, circulated scribally, and played a key role in the godly sociability of the family and the surrogate kinship group of the gathered church or incipient sect. Intended to be read by kin, friends and descendants, they operated in the context of a piety that was as communal in character as it was introspective. His description of such texts as multi-layered sites of conversation within and between generations chimes with Smith's interest in life writing as a retrospective, mediated and intertextual process. It underlines our growing awareness that the boundaries between the personal and public were extremely porous in the cultures of documentation that proliferated in early modern society. As well as blurring the lines between biography and autobiography, these insights converge with the findings of the recent surge of scholarship on the history of the archive. In turn, the remit of this field has expanded from the study of legal and political institutions to encompass the wider practices of record keeping facilitated by the spread of literacy and changing technologies of communication. Archival documents are increasingly being situated in the context of broader ecologies of writing, paperwork and print with which they coexisted, including those produced within the forum of the family. They're constituent elements of what Daniel Wolfe has called the social circulation of the past. Building on suggestions made by the Dutch archival scientist Eric Ketelaar, these are only now coming to be the subject of more sustained scrutiny, partly thanks to a new Leverhulme project funded here at Birmingham and led by Imogen Peck. The new history of the archive draws inspiration from Maurice Holbach's classic study of the inextricability of individual and collective memory, as well as the influential work of Jan and Aleida Assmann on the shift from communicative to cultural memory, a process spanning the 80 to 100 years within which three generations coexist. In the words of Astrid Earle, the generation serves as a kind of switchboard between individual memory and larger frames of collective remembrance. This lecture inhabits the space between these two fields of inquiry. In what follows, I treat the generation as a prime example of what Pierre Nora famously termed lieu de mémoire, as a site where, as he put it, memory secretes itself and blocks the work of forgetting. In doing so, I'm conscious of the inherently spatial quality of the medieval and early modern ars memoriae, which trained contemporaries in the technique of mentally creating theatres, castles and palaces in which to store knowledge and information. Here I considered the place that the generations occupied on the page and within the space of the material world. I investigate the Janus-faced nature of the generation as an entity that's located in the present, but simultaneously looks back towards the past and forwards to the future. To borrow a particularly resonant phrase from W.H. Auden, it links the dead with the unborn. To develop this argument, I want to focus on three manifestations of the generational transmission of memory. First, genealogies. Second, books and Bibles that were passed down within families. And thirdly, physical artefacts that announce their status as effective objects and heirlooms. England, like the rest of Europe, was gripped by genealogical fever in the early modern period. This was a consequence of a social order that was in considerable flux, and in which the conventional criterion for determining rank and status, blood, was in the process of being challenged by the wealth of the upwardly mobile nouveau riche. Alongside heraldry, genealogy assumed new importance as the visitations of representatives of the College of Arms became increasingly preoccupied with tracing descent. The impulse to find, or to invent, evidence of the antiquity and ancestry of one's family often had the Norman conquest as its endpoint. This was a mark of social protection, but it must also be situated in a context of renewed interest in the lineages of Adam and Christ fostered by the Reformation. Underpinned by erudite theological research, English Bibles of the period carried pictorial diagrams summarising these. This pedigree of Timothy Sullivan of Dublin starts with Adam, our proto-parent. The early 17th century genealogy of the Poulet family of Somerset begins with a depiction of Adam and Eve bearing the dynasty's shield. The Pophams presented themselves as descendants of Noah, illustrating their role with a miniature image of the ark in which the patriarch and his family had been preserved from the flood, based on the prototype in the genealogy attached to the King James Bible. Others mimicked the legendary tree of Jesse, including this elaborate pedigree painting produced for Sir Nicholas Bacon of Raveningham Hall in Norfolk, which shows him standing with his two wives and their progeny living and extinct. The branches stretch up towards the sky in a flattering image that stresses the future promise of the dynasty. Dating from the early 17th century, the genealogy of the Hesketh family of Rufford also depicts its principal worthies in the form of small portraits. If the length of many parchments and rolls proudly boasted about the fecundity of the families they described, others tell a story of steady decline and even expiry over time. This pedigree from Cheshire testifies to the genetic lottery that resulted in the end of a line. The final 3 roundels record 3 sons who died without issue: Robert, Thomas, and Nicholas, called Mad Clifford. The latter's insanity evidently rendered him incapable of generating an heir, with the result that the estate descended to a cousin in a collateral branch. Around the edges, it was common to include transcriptions of documents attesting to the property that had been passed down with the family name, and was integral to its claims to gentry and aristocratic status. Blood and land, genealogy and geography were inextricably linked, as the endeavours of antiquarians like William Dugdale amply remind us. Whether enshrined in specially commissioned vellum and parchment rolls or hastily scribbled on scraps of paper, such objects must be recognised as forms of life writing. They entailed representations of people and recollections of place, including the parish churches that they'd endowed and their grand country seats. Some were even transformed into stone and marble funeral monuments, such as the Fetty Place tomb at Swinbrook in Oxfordshire, and this engraved brass of the Beale family of Maidstone in Kent. The Royal Proclamation of 1560 prohibiting iconoclastic attacks upon medieval memorials said that this obscured the memory of the leading families of the realm and jeopardised the true course of their inheritance. It threatened to cast them into oblivion, which is why some were in turn enshrined in genealogical rolls in a bid to preserve them on paper for posterity, as we see here with the Catholic Shirley family. Lower down the social scale, the Devonshire farmer Robert Furze compiled a book about his family for his son, which combined an account of the simple, rude, unlearned men and women of small possession and ability who were his progenitors, with information about the extensive portfolio of land holdings he had since accumulated. He was not ashamed of his humble beginnings. Most surviving pedigrees prioritised continuity over chronology. Rarely marked with dates, they're often disconnected from the temporal events that occurred during the lifetimes of those they commemorated. But sometimes they've been turned into a medium for recording the religious history and confessional credentials of the families in question. They help us to chart how some eagerly embraced or fiercely resisted the Reformation, and how others quietly followed the path of conformity and assimilated themselves to the new religion. The latter quietly gloss over the exploits of spiritual black sheep and suppress evidence of the popish superstition of their forebears during the Dark Middle Ages. The former highlight precociously Protestant ancestors who advanced the cause of the gospel. The pedigree of the Gloucestershire family of Sudeley has a pictorial vignette of its forebear, William Tracy, whose bones were posthumously exhumed and burnt for his heresy in the reign of Henry VIII, based on an illustration in Fox's Acts and Monuments, which was ironically of Wycliffe, not of Tracy. In contrast, Catholic families like the Draycotts of Leicestershire used their genealogies to celebrate their stalwart nonconformity and sacrificial suffering for the sake of their beleaguered faith. Covering 21 generations, this Draycott genealogy lists John, who was committed close prisoner for refusing to attend church in 1562, and his son Philip, who, quote, continued a perfect recusant to his death in 1604. The Northumberland gentleman Sir William Swinburne viewed his as a monument to the continuance of our family and its loyalty to its principles for conscience sake, by wandering through the adversity of difficult times. Confections of selective remembering and forgetting, genealogies supply oblique insight into how families negotiated the profound religious ruptures that opened up in this era. They attest to the processes of amnesia as well as embellishment that are hallmarks of this genre. Aviatar Zerubbabel speaks of their strategic agendas of inclusion and exclusion, which reconstruct the past with an eye to shaping the present and future, and describes them as creative forms of genealogical engineering. Such pedigrees also frequently shade into prose histories. Taking direction from Scripture, the devout Protestant Edward Deering regarded it as his solemn duty to leave a ledger record to my posterity and preserve the deeds of his progenitors, thanking God that he was derived from a worthy race of noble ancestors, and for the godliness that his family displayed. The royalist antiquary Gervase Hollis wrote an extended account of his family during his exile in the 1650s to supply his son Fresherville and future descendants with patterns for imitation, asserting that genealogy without history was an unspirited, dead and useless carcass. His book was a series of mini-biographies of the forefathers whom he revered, in which their virtues were leavened by mention of their eccentricities and imperfections. On the other side of the ideological divide, Sir Thomas Shirley's Catholic Armourist is a curious hybrid of heraldry and martyrology, which describes the services performed by his pious forebears in the Holy Land in crusading times, as well as their defence of the Church of Rome after the Reformation. It also gleefully records the providential ruination of a branch of the family that had been infected with the plague of heresy. The 17th century history of the Rookwoods in Stanningfield in Suffolk listed several members of the dynasty that had entered religious orders on the continent, alongside the two Ambroses executed for treasonous complicity in the Gunpowder Plot and a conspiracy against William III in 1605 and 1696, respectively. This family chronicle was composed of what the author spoke of as the sundry fragments of a pitiful wrack. Its author had gathered up from the storm that had washed the seas, and with which the injury of time hath so much defaced. It's a text that attests the peculiar vulnerability of Catholic lineages whose sons and daughters became priests and nuns to extinction. Suffused with yearning for an era that was already disappearing into the distance, Catholic histories of this kind, consciously and unconsciously, harked back to the place of a glorious past before the onslaught of Protestantism. Nostalgia only crystallized as a linguistic concept at the end of the 17th century, though it has always existed. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this species of wistful longing centred as much upon the places from which people had been dislocated as upon a lost age. It was a form of homesickness. Others, like the Coosmakers of Westwood in Surrey and the Commelines of Gloucestershire, recalled forebears who'd fled persecution in France and Flanders. In remembering earlier times, they were also remembering their homelands from which their families had first originated, albeit in increasingly faint outline. In the 1640s and 50s, John Lamotte recounted the tribulations of his ancestors in the Low Countries 8 decades earlier to members of his household orally, in so punctual and feeling a manner as if he had been an eyewitness, yea, a sharer in them. He still thought of himself as part of the diaspora of reformed refugees, consciously reactivating the memory of the events that had prompted their flight into exile. He imagined himself as a time traveller. In a culture committed to primogeniture and patrilineal descent, genealogy can seem to be a literary and epistemological form that treats women largely as vessels for childbearing. Male heirs and their seed prevail, though the 14-foot-long pedigree of Sir Randall Brereton of Malpas in Cheshire, describing the issue of the 4 daughters he'd had with his wife Eleanor, alongside the children and grandchildren of his 10 sons, is something of an exception. It's also a mistake to suppose that the compilation and writing of genealogies was monopolised by men. In fact, women were no less zealous and increasingly prominent as genealogists, as Kate Hodgkin has shown. The cases of Lucy Hutchinson, Alice Thornton and Lady Anne Clifford demonstrate the key part that they played in recording and preserving their families' histories for succeeding generations. The instincts that gave rise to Clifford's great book and voluminous diaries and memoirs also found pictorial expression in the remarkable triptych she had painted for the benefit of her daughters, which depicts her in different stages of her own life cycle. Meanwhile, the disparaging rhetoric of old wives' tales is an indirect measure of the role of the female sex as custodians and conveyors of genealogical knowledge beyond the circles of the elite. Mothers were vital links in the chain of generational transmission of family information, especially the births of their children and grandchildren. Frances Matthews' list of her offspring, now in York Minster Library, provides a tangible glimpse of a practice that was much more widespread. Elizabeth Walker, wife of an Essex minister, recorded instances of God's providences to the couple, including the safe delivery of 11 infants, beside some abortive or untimely births, in a large octavo book, neatly bound, gilded, and ruled in red. This was partly transcribed by her husband Anthony as a memorial to her after her death, so that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children. In 1610, aged 85, and in anticipation of her own demise, Rose Hickman set down on paper certain old stories of the difficulties her family had faced during Mary's reign, when they'd been forced to seek asylum in Antwerp, to be perused by her children and posterity. Some such mothers' legacies were subsequently published by their authors, or by local Protestant ministers to instruct the young that they'd died bringing into the world. Notebooks in which culinary recipes and herbal remedies mingle with data about births, marriages and deaths, such as these examples once owned by Anne Glid and Rebecca Winch, supply further relevant evidence of the movement of memory from living recollection to written record. As Elaine Lyon has aptly remarked, these items too must be seen as part of the paperwork of kinship. They are one of the forms taken by matriarchives. So this brings me to the second set of sources I wish to discuss in this lecture, the many copies of Bibles, prayer books and devotional tracts whose flyleaves, margins and blank spaces have been used as locations for preserving genealogical information, and which bear annotations indicating that they were passed down the generations. Some of these were medieval primers, the calendars in which had long served as a suitable space for recording the christenings, weddings and burials of family members. Their continuing deployment for this purpose smoothed the gradual passage from the pre to the post-Reformation era and ensured that these items were kept, despite theological changes that undermined their role as salvific remembrances and archives of efficacious prayer. 2 books of ours associated with the Roberts family of Willesden in Middlesex offer a unique window on this process. Both Thomas and his son Edmund continued to use them for record keeping, though the latter subsequently erased entries about sons and daughters who died in infancy or childhood, occluding their place in the family's history. Later descendants extended the lists to the succeeding generations up to 1678, adding details such as the names of each baby's godparents, which reflect the dense and tangled webs that connected biological relatives with spiritual kith and kin. their survival highlights the capacity of the family to temper and absorb the disruptive religious changes taking place around it. These commemorative practices carried over into Protestant book culture. Bibles and copies of the Book of Common Prayer became new locations for preserving genealogical information and for nurturing the next generation in the true religion. Sometimes the entries in these books are rather haphazardly written, in untidy hands at different times. Others are inserted neatly and seem to have been added as a block in a conscious act of memorialization. Visibly displaying a family's piety, such volumes served as a safe deposit box for its memory. The families they describe usually consist of fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, and their direct descendants. If they epitomise the idea of the generation as an arrow that travels through time, they also point towards the complexity and capaciousness of the family as a concept in this period. Step-parents and children are common occurrences, and there's a touching tendency to remember babies and children who died prematurely. Some, like the Smith family Bible, incorporate stillbirths, while notes taken from the Bible of the Harcourt and Skrine families of Somerset record a series of miscarriages. Family memory was thus broad and encompassing. If such books reflect the democratisation of Bible reading and the popularisation of the Church of England's liturgy, they also attest to the extent to which genealogical literacy embedded itself at many levels of English society by the end of the 17th century. It's suggestive of the preoccupation with biblical lineages that I've already discussed, that some chose to inscribe their families' births, marriages and deaths adjacent to the beginning of St. Matthew's Gospel, the opening chapter of which was entitled The Genealogy of Christ. A 1699 King James Version, for instance, lists the children God hath given Henry and Mary Chandler on this very page. As time progressed and the possession of clocks and watches spread, the temporal precision with which life cycle events were recorded increased. Where earlier texts are approximate in their timings, later ones fix it to the hour and even the minute. Registers of this kind expanded into bigger family chronicles, biographical memoirs, and first-person narratives. They too became sites for life writing. John Norgate used the end papers of his Bible to commemorate the life of his stepfather, Nicholas Felton, Bishop of Ely, and to tell how he'd been born lame on his right side, but transcended his physical disability to become a successful London bookbinder and stationer. Pages that were part of a book inherited by the dissenter Giles Say from his dying brother Francis in 1640 trace the history of their mother, the daughter of Huguenot refugees who'd found refuge in Southampton at the beginning of Queen Elizabeth's reign. In turn, these were conscientiously preserved by his child Sarah, who apparently set very great value on the productions of his pen and papers which he left behind him, and which she kept with an affectionate care even to the minutest scraps, before bequeathing the whole archive to her son. A Bible belonging to the Singer family included details of its sufferings for nonconformity and the emigration of some of its members to America in the company of the Quaker William Penn, where they settled on the banks of the Delaware River. This volume doubles as a genealogy and a testimony of suffering. And here we see the copies that were produced of this history by a 19th century descendant. The fly-leaves of Mariabella Farnborough's late 17th century Bible, a photocopy of which has been deposited in the Quaker Library in London, include many obituaries of other friends. Her brother Joseph was a very honest religious man, and her sister Anne was an affectionate mother. Echoing the content of funeral sermons, such eulogising microbiographies provide telling evidence of the post-Reformation impulse to historicise the deceased. In place of invitations to pray for their souls, arose the wish to fix them firmly in the historical record. In a 1594 Geneva Bible, now at Ohio State University, this process has an especially self-conscious dimension. Its mid-17th century owner, John at Heel, has annotated the marginalia made by his predecessors, identifying the writers, supplying further details of their lives, and adding occasional comments in the first person. Below the scribbles and doodles on the title page of the concordances, he inserted a note about William Ream, who had married my father's sister Mary, remarking reprovingly, "All this, I think, was written by him while he might have been better employed." Texts such as these are encrusted with several layers of a dynasty's history, augmented with additional information over time, from recipes, rhymes and drawings to pressed flowers and leaves and sepia photographs. Bibles and prayer books became shrines to family memory. Some descendants transcribed earlier annotations and entries onto slips of paper as a labour of love. They were also often embellished with decorative features, metal clasps, ribbon bookmarks, and leather and textile bindings. Passed down both patrilineal and matrilineal lines, many overtly proclaimed their status as gifts and bequests. A folder copy of Bailey's Practice of Piety carries the inscription, "Anne Dalton owns this book, given to her by her dear mother, Mrs. Dalton." 3 tiny devotional tracts in the Huntingdon Library were a New Year's gift to Elizabeth Denny from her dear mother in 1695. Francis Newbury's 1580 edition of the Geneva Bible and Psalms was given to him by his father, Samuel, on the 7th of October 1644, with a charge to keep it as long as I live. Aged 20 at the time, perhaps it was a present that marked his passage to manhood. Rebecca Fisher's Bible not only contains an inscription indicating that it was a gift from her father in 1678, but also a printed notice of her birth and baptism, 10 days apart in January 1660. In a context in which the rates of infant and maternal mortality and premature death were high, such books became textual monuments to the family members who had died. Lady Friedeswide Brewer turned an octavo New Testament into a portable paper memorial of her son Maurice, who died aged 17 years, 7 weeks and 3 days in 1721. Items of this kind were freighted with fresh significance in the aftermath of bereavement. Some went beyond a mere record of the linkage between book giving and life cycle events, adding more detailed instructions for the edification and attention of their heirs. A 1640 King James Version in the UL in Cambridge is particularly compelling. Its embroidered cover was worked by Mary Bradley, who gave the book to her own child as a legacy, imploring her to preserve and continue it down to posterity in her family, in case I have no children of my own. A list of its subsequent possessors appears at the bottom of the page. They duly continued the tradition of recording births, marriage and deaths in fulfilment of the desire of my ancient parent until the late 1780s. The presence of multiple generations of genealogical records in these texts provides clear evidence that they were indeed kept as precious family treasures. So does the sentence written on one Bodleian Library copy of John Cousin's A Collection of Private Devotions by the Anglican clergyman Charles Underwood in 1876. This book was my great-great-great-great-grandmother's, Letitia Gregory of Northup, Herefordshire. And this monumental copy of a 15th century Wycliffite translation of the New Testament overtly advertises its status as an heirloom of the Davenport family of Bramall Hall near Stockport in Cheshire. On one of the pages inside, in a text that was subsequently tooled in gold on its leather cover. It's a book bound to the house as much to its historic inhabitants. Unfortunately, a later descendant sold this manuscript relic of Lollardy, apparently to purchase a racehorse, and it was eventually presented to to the Cambridge University Library by the bibliophile who subsequently acquired it. The itineraries of other texts tell stories about the travels of their owners. A French Bible of 1554, bound with the metrical psalms, lists the children of the Mobilo family, born in the parish of St Martin's in the Fields between 1665 and 1680. Whether and when members of an earlier generation had brought the book with them from France is unclear. But the entries written in English are suggestive of the extent to which the family had assimilated into its adopted country by the mid-17th century. Mementos of displacement, such books animated memories of the country and life that their predecessors had left behind. They afford us a fleeting glimpse of the stories that accumulated around these texts, retold as they were displayed, fingered and held by successive generations. Such narratives have aptly been described as oral heirlooms. The medium of the voice as a genre of material memory and as a mode of giving expression to loss is rarely accessible to us at a distance of 3 and 4 centuries, but it's left spidery traces in the inscriptions carried by these books, which in turn have helped to preserve them for posterity. Closely charged with emotionally charged life course rituals, they reproduce kinship and create intergenerational memory, drawing attention to the passage of years and the transience of human lives. They too serve as a vehicle for bringing past time into the present and projecting it forward into the future. The third body of evidence to which I turn briefly now comprises what, following the anthropologist Janet Hoskins, I shall call biographical and autobiographical objects. Lying in the background are Arjun Abadurai and Igor Kopitov's work on the social life and cultural biographies of things, and Alfred Gell's influential theory about the agency of art and artefacts. Closely linked with the home and with the liturgical rites of passage, the items I shall analyse shed further light on the domestic and other settings in which family and generational memory was evoked and exercised. Possessions that were entangled with the histories of the people who owned, used and then handed them on to their children and grandchildren, brothers, sisters, nieces, nephews and cousins. Their journeys through time and space illuminate the interweaving of human and historical life cycles and of communicative with cultural memory. These objects were vessels and carriers of the life stories of their erstwhile owners to their descendants, as well as into new locations. To quote the archaeologist Roberta Gilchrist, heirlooms are palimpsests, layered with personal and ancestral identities, sustaining both personhood and collective memory. The very act of touching and handling them provokes an emotional response which stimulates a temporal effect and a memory of the past, but also a sense of belonging and a connection to the future. We might begin with the hallowed remnants that English Catholics preserved from destruction during the Reformation and kept safe in household shrines: vestments, chalices and pyxes, images and relics. After migrating into private settings, they became inextricably linked with recollections of the lay people who preserved them, as well as of medieval Catholic England, a mythical land that priestly polemicists were in the process of inventing in order to condemn it. Their circulation around the recusant underground cemented the links between families of blood and families of faith. The Jesuit John Poyntz gave the arm bone of Sir Thomas Cantilupe of Hereford to his sister in Paris in 1651. Elizabeth Moore, the prioress of the Bruges Augustinians, donated a vertebra of her celebrated ancestor Sir Thomas to the convent, and his hair shirt also circulated within the family before being absorbed into ecclesiastical ownership. Letters, vitae and even signatures of priests martyred for their faith likewise provided a material focus for the hope that Catholicism would in due course be restored to dominance. When he was arrested at Leicester in 1582, William Hants was carrying a drop of his brother's blood that was hanged for the Catholic religion. On entering a Franciscan nunnery in the Low Countries in 1624, that 3 sisters of the Ingleby family brought with them one of the limbs of their executed Uncle Francis as part of their dowry. These heirlooms were the holy bodies of their own relatives. The chests and cabinets in which families kept such keepsakes in turn became shrines to the memory of the past generations who'd sacrificed their lives in defiance of Protestant heretics. These Catholic items bear comparison with a Protestant material culture that Tara Hamling of this parish and others have uncovered in all its rich variety. We're increasingly aware of the liturgical items that clergy and lay people gave to their parish churches in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, such as this communion cup and paten given to St Mary's Lambeth in memory of Joyce Featley, wife of its rector in 1639. And these flagons commemorating 2 sisters from St Mary's Castlegate in York, donated by a relative in 1724. We've also become familiar with tableware, furniture and other forms of domestic decoration that fused private and public memory and biblical history and secular genealogy. Inscribed with the initials of married couples, many plates and chargers that bear the image of the temptation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were given as wedding gifts. They document a ritual moment in the life cycle when a new family was formed and when a husband and wife embarked on the sacred task of engendering offspring. This extraordinary Delftware plate, dated 1692, shows the well-known motif of the reformers seated around a table and the failed attempt of the Pope and a cardinal, bishop and monk to blow out the candle of the gospel. Bearing the names of an Amsterdam tailor and his wife, and possibly produced to mark another kind of anniversary, it too reveals how individual and collective remembrance, personal and national history intersected. Its iconography also highlights the role that the Reformation played in creating new spiritual families, both the imagined pan-European community of Protestant siblings depicted in this painting, and churches and sects that made liberal use of the affirming vocabulary of kinship. Jewellery, baptismal spoons and drinking vessels are other types of artefact that marked vital junctures in people's lives and helped them make sense of decisive events. This silver locket celebrates the birth of John Monson at midnight on the 12th of September 1597. It may have been designed to hold part of the child's call. Inscribed Mary Turner, aged 2 years, 14 days, September the 2nd, 1752. A mug in the Fitzwilliam Museum advertises its commemorative function. Another declares its role as a mnemonic even more overtly. When this you see, remember me, GL. Dated and didactic objects both embody and narrate individual and family histories, even if they now do so very elusively. It's not always easy to document their status and movements and heirlooms. This Middle English term was originally a descriptor for a tool or implement transmitted to one's legal heirs, though its meanings were migrating in a figurative direction in this period, combining the concept of inheritance with a word for a frame for weaving cloth. It signified an item that was tied to and devolved with a parcel of real estate. It was a piece of furniture or movable property conveyed to one's descendants via last wills and testaments. Some such chattels were even engraved with the word heirloom, including, and this is again thanks to Tara, the oak dining table commissioned by the Lancashire gentleman Peter Catterall of Crook Hall. The panel above its central leg reads "An heirloom to this house forever," with his initials and the date 1630-something. Such items were inextricably linked with the physical fabric of the household and with the space and place of the family home. Finally, we might consider a few of the ways in which people below the level of the gentry left records of their lives on the material environment surrounding them. Surviving graffiti on the lime-washed walls of parish churches enables us to hear the lost voices of ordinary people mourning dead children, relatives and friends, determined to prevent them from being forgotten. Some provide a simple record of names, others take the form of miniature gravestones with dates and initials. At Stansfield in Suffolk, a neatly written sentence that wraps itself around one of the pillars declares, J.F. died the first day of February 1708. These ad hoc epitaphs are an overlooked element of the early modern arts of remembrance. As Juliet Fleming has suggested, graffiti is also one of the arts of writing. Nor can we ignore the simple tokens of maternal love left by unmarried mothers when they deposited the infants for whom they could not care at London's Foundling Hospital. Buttons, beads, coins and fruit pips, as well as small engraved discs. Intended to serve as mementos of the women who brought them into the world, these most heartrending of biographical and autobiographical objects are yet another testament to the vitality of intergenerational transmission in early modern England. And so now, at last, to draw to a close. Ironically, the presence of the manuscripts, books and objects I've discussed in this lecture in local and national archives, libraries and museums indicates the breaking of the generational chain that ensured their preservation down the centuries. However, it also reflects their transmutation into forms of public patrimony. This is sometimes a consequence of the fact that they've been detached from their original contexts, passed into the hands of collectors, and gradually shed their status as treasured possessions and talismans of genealogical memory. But sometimes it indexes the desire of individual families to find a more secure place of safekeeping, or to make these relics of their personal histories into resources for the wider community. For all those discovered in dusty boxes and rescued from attics festooned with cobwebs, others have been lost or still remain in private hands. In the case of the Wilbraham diary with which I began, both observations apply. The pale photographic facsimile in the record office that sits alongside the annotated almanac testifies to the competing imperatives felt by so many families. In this lecture, I've argued that the generation should be recognised as an important site of life writing, poised between time and place, and glancing forwards and backwards simultaneously, it breaches the divide between the dead and the unborn. What I hope to have demonstrated is the critical role that generational transmission has played in shaping the vision of the early modern past that's available for us to recover and analyse. Families of blood and families of faith are among the invisible technicians that have created the repositories on which we rely. Their efforts to dictate how the people of the future would understand a present and past punctuated by divisive religious change comprise a key part of what I call the Reformation of the generations. Thank you.